The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, folks. Dr. Charlie Hall here, Texas A&M University. Appreciate y'all being here this morning for this third of our webinar series entitled The Latest Consumer Trends Research. I'm joined here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Marco Palma, also of Texas A&M University, and he and I are the coordinators of this webinar series. So again, we appreciate you being here. Now, just a few logistical details in terms of being able to manipulate the webinar experience. You probably have a dialog box that looks something like this. Anytime you want to close it, you can click on that orange button and it'll close the panel, and if you click it again, it'll open the panel. And then you can also make the viewing panel full screen by clicking on View and then clicking on Full Screen. And you can also change the audio. If you're having some difficulty with your microphone and speakers, you can always select Use Telephone and dial in the number and plug in the access code in the audio pin. So it just depending on if you're enjoying the microphone and speakers, no need to change it. Now, if you want to ask a question during the webinar, everyone is muted because everyone's system is different. We want to have an enjoyable time for everyone. So if you have a question, plug it in the question box, and then we'll address all those at the end. So Marco and I will be monitoring those questions. So again, feel free to type in any question you have, and we may even address some of them during the webinar by typing a response back to you. All right, if you would, please fill out a very short evaluation survey at the end. As soon as I close everything down, then you'll be sent a link to an evaluation survey. It's only 4 short questions, so it always helps us to get your feedback, so please fill that out. And if you have colleagues that weren't here today and you want to share this particular recording, everyone's going to receive an email with a link to view the recorded version of today's session. So that'll be coming to you within the next 24 to 36 hours. It always depends a little bit on the GoToMeeting system. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our friend and colleague who's going to be today's presenter, Dr. Bridget Behe of Michigan State University. And Bridget has been in the industry for a long time, obviously. It needs very little introduction, but she's known throughout the industry as kind of the consumer research guru. And you can see her pedigree there, so she's got a lot of educational qualifications, but she's just a heck of a nice person and a great market researcher. So, Bridget, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, change you to presenter, and you can kick off with your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning. I want to share with you 3 studies that we've been working on. One has to do with eco-attitudes and purchase behaviors, a study we did with American and Canadian consumers. And the second study I want to share with you is about price elasticity. We're very reluctant to increase prices in the industry, and with some colleagues we got some good evidence together that having a little bit of a higher price really can help the bottom line. And the last one, probably to me, is the most exciting turn in my career, is working with eye tracking technology to understand what is attracting consumers' attention. So I would be remiss if I didn't thank my colleagues on all of these studies. I'm very fortunate to have the assistance of a lot of folks, and I do appreciate their input on all 3 of these projects. So let's go right into the first one. This was a study that we were able to do through a USDA Federal State Marketing Improvement Program grant. And it was based on some research that we had done in 2009 looking at consumer preferences for containers. Well, what we did with this particular study was to adapt a survey form from some prior work, and it's important to understand this was conducted online. We used a professional firm, Global Marketing Insight, and we had consumers from both Canada and the United States participate in this. 2,511 in total. About 3/4 of those had purchased plants in the year prior to the study, and about 27% had not. So what we did was we looked at this 73%, and we wanted to see if we could classify them or group them into segments based upon some of their preferences and their past purchases. So one of the things that we showed them was images of plants in containers. And we used 3 price points for the 4-inch container from $1.99 up to $2.99. We had 3 types of plants. We had tomato transplants that were representative of food-producing plants. We used basil, which was representative of an edible plant, and we also showed them a chrysanthemum, which was an indication of an ornamental plant. Now, from past research, we knew that there was diversity among container preferences, so we included 4 kinds of containers: a conventional container, compostable, plantable, and a recyclable container. And we were curious to understand what type of conservation practices or sustainable practices that consumers would be interested in. So we included 2 specifically: water-saving practices and energy-saving practices. We also used the word sustainable production practices to see if that term resonated more or less than some of these others. And we were also interested in where the plant was grown, so we used 3 descriptions: local, within the country, or imported. And I'm going to show you an example of what we showed to the customers. But we also got plant purchase information and demographic characteristics. So this is what we showed consumers. Not 3 at a time, but 1 at a time. But this description here tells them it was grown within the country or locally or imported, and this is a plantable container or a recyclable container or a compostable container. And we simply asked them how likely they would be to purchase that particular plant. Now, among all the results we got, of course, some demographics, and I'll show you these briefly just to make the point that they were mostly representative of the U.S. and Canada on average. Our household income was slightly higher, and we also got a slightly higher population that lived in metropolitan areas. But otherwise, they were generally representative of residents of North America. Now, to me, here's the really cool part. Ben Campbell took the lead on doing the analysis, and we identified 8 distinctly different consumer groups. And I want to go through some of these individually, but I want to show you how many of these. There's 1, 2, 3 of them specifically were interested in food. We have ornamental interests blended with some food interests, but it was really fascinating to see the diversity of segments. The largest one was the annual gardeners, and the smallest one was the plant fanatic, or excuse me, the foodies all over. But let's look at these very briefly, individually. So this one, 8.6%, a moderately sized segment. But the neat thing about them was all of these 217 people had purchased a flowering shrub. Now this was substantially more than the 29% average of the sample. And when we look here at their container preference, they preferred a compostable container. And we'll see most of these groups preferred energy-saving production practices. In fact, for this group, water-saving practices had less value than conventional production practices. So I think as we move forward and marketing energy conservation practices and water conservation practices, that perhaps this term is going to resonate more than water saving, and I think we've got to do a better job of marketing production practices that save water. The plant fanatics, a fairly small group. What was interesting or most noteworthy for these folks is half of them purchased every single type of the 10 plants listed in the survey. more likely to reside in a metropolitan area, which was surprising. It indicates to me that some of these folks are doing balcony, container, patio, porch gardening. And as we saw in the prior segment, energy-saving production methods were really what resonated with them. The third group, vegetable and perennial passionates, this was a moderately sized customer segment. We saw a lower percentage of African Americans or Asians, so it was a higher percentage of Caucasians. And interestingly enough, a higher percentage of men fell into this group. What was important to them was plant origin, and this segment expressed the greatest negative value for imported plants. So if you're marketing a local product, especially for this segment, having that probably is a very positive thing. The great indoors, a little bit larger than most, almost 10% of our sample. But what was noteworthy about this group was that 60% had purchased indoor flowering potted plants. These folks preferred compostable containers and expressed a strong dislike for recyclable containers. And that's interesting because you think if they're using that plant indoors, that perhaps recycling would be the way they'd like to dispose of it, but they preferred compostable containers, and they too were interested in the energy-saving production practices. I think this segment, number 5, is the one that we're most used to seeing, and this was our largest group, the annual gardeners. What was interesting or most distinguished about this group was that more than half had purchased flowering annuals and vegetables. These folks were not as strong in their dislike for imported products, and here again, energy saving resonated more than the other production practices. But these folks, these were the ones that preferred the compostable containers. Flowering abundance, these were the perennial buyers. 81% had purchased the flowering perennials, and about half had purchased flowering annuals and flowering shrubs. So we called this segment the flowering abundance segment. They preferred a plantable container, unlike the other segments. So the take-home message here, particularly for perennials and for some annuals and shrubs, a plantable container might appeal to this particular consumer segment. These last two really have to do with food, and we called this segment Foodies All Over. Now, this was our smallest group at 6%, but every single one of these 150 consumers had purchased a fruit tree, and 2/3 of them had purchased herbs and vegetables. What was interesting was this demographic is slightly younger, and it was also interesting that they had slightly less education. Like most of the other segments, they were interested in energy-saving production practices, but this group had a slight preference for recyclable containers. And then our last group, the herbivores, a lot like the Foodies All Over, but this group all had purchased herbs. This was the highest purchase of herbs among all the segment, and 252 folks from our sample in this group. These were the folks that were interested in water-saving production practices and the slight preference for the recyclable containers. So you can see we've got a lot of diversity still in container preference, more towards the compostable than the recyclable or the plantable, but some segments had very strong feelings about that. We were able to see that energy conservation methods or production systems as a term or a word resonated more with most of these segments. Water conservation and sustainably grown, not as relatable. And we don't have these really clear distinctions between the food and the ornamental plant buyers. There's a lot of overlap. But I think when we look at the products that they purchase most of, that gives us a good basis for segmentation, and we can begin to think about how the product on the whole, the package of production method and container and where that plant was grown, how that whole package can be marketed. So now I want to turn to a second study that we just finished and just published. It was in cooperation with a 10% project at today's Garden Center, and some of you may have recently seen this online. Well, it really was Carol Miller's brainchild, and she came to me asking for some collaboration on a study to see if the impact of raising prices really was detrimental, because we're all kind of geared toward lowering prices, and we want to make sure that product gets sold, but oftentimes we don't really think about the impact on the bottom line. So when we do a study like this, when we look at sales and vary the price over time, this is an economic concept called price elasticity. Now I'm going to save the theoretical details for Marco and Charlie, but I'm going to kind of give you the nuts and bolts and then show you the results. So we had 3 garden centers cooperate, very reputable garden centers. We used both branded plants and non-branded plants, and we adjusted prices over 3 weeks. So it's important that you remember that the unbranded plants are held constant during this time, and we're using this as a comparison. So in our mind, or our perspective, the branded plant was differentiated, and we wanted to see what the impact to total revenue was when we increased the price of the branded plant over time. So we assumed that branded plants were representative of a differentiated product, that consumers could tell the difference, and in some cases they might even be willing to pay for some of those differences. So in week 1, the test plants, or the branded plants, were priced 10% below the normal, or 10% below the non-branded price. In week 2, the test plants, or the branded plants, were priced at the same price point that the non-branded items or the normal items were. And then in week 3, we increased the price of the test plants, or the branded plants, by 10%. So we went from 10% below normal to 10% above normal. So what we would expect is a decrease in the number of units sold. But what we want to discover is how much of a decrease was caused by that change in price. So I'm going to show you results from summer winds. And the test plant in this case was a select number of proven winners. The comparable plants, for example, if these were petunias, these would be the petunias that were branded by proven winners, and these would be the unbranded product. So when we go from below average to average, the branded plant sales increased 22.5%, but the sales in the unbranded plants increased 11.3%. So yes, that was more, but we also had an increase in the unbranded plant. Now here's where we really expect to see sales fall, is when we increase the price of the branded plants over the unbranded plants, but we still saw a price increase. Another set that they used at Summer Winds was some of the Blooms branded product. From week 1 to week 2, sales of the branded product increased 40.2%, but sales of the unbranded product increased 11.3%. From week 2 to week 3, remember the test plants now are 10% higher than the unbranded plants. We were not surprised to see a sales decrease, but it was only 1.3%. We had an increase in the unbranded plants. And then another set of plants that we examined were branded the burpee vegetables. From week 1 to week 2, sales increased in the branded and slightly decreased in the comparables. And here, when we increased the branded plants, sales decreased for both, almost 10%. Now, I'm not showing all the results, but I want to kind of get to some of the conclusions so we can see the impact of this. Now, sales increased each day over the 3-week test period, and weekend sales were higher than weekday sales. So Marco was really the one that did the economic magic here. He used a double logarithmic econometric model, and we found that the branded products were inelastic, and I'm going to tell you what that means. That meant that for every 10% change in price, either up and down, we didn't lose 10% of the sales. We only lost 8.27% of sales. So we tested the validity of the model, and it was less than 1% off. So it's a very strong, solid model. Well, what does that mean to most of us? Well, if you're not an economist, what this means is that the total revenue earned by the garden centers during the time period we raised prices was 2.3% higher in spite of selling 8.27% fewer units. So the operation made money even though they increased prices 10%. Conversely, when we lowered prices, we decreased the total revenue by 27%. So decreasing prices is very detrimental to the bottom line. Now, what does that mean for most of us? Well, we don't believe that it's time to raise all prices in the short run, because Charlie will tell us we're still in the midst of a very slow economic recovery. But here we have evidence that when we have truly differentiated product, or product that consumers can tell the difference on, that many times we're going to be better off, meaning we'll have more revenue if we increase that product by a certain percentage and accept that we're going to sell fewer units. So this was really exciting, and we hope to expand this in the spring of 2013 and continue to gather evidence that increasing prices is not entirely a bad thing. So the last piece of research, kind of the area that I want to talk about, is some eye tracking work, and I've been very fortunate to lead the team in collecting some of this data and gathering some results. And I also want to share with you that even among the retail industry, the uses of this eye tracking, these devices, really has been kept proprietary. So as we discover what is happening in retail displays in horticulture, we're also contributing to the knowledge in mainstream retailing, and that's been kind of an exciting thing for me. So a little bit of background information before I share with you some of the data. So the fastest movement that our human body can make is an eye movement. And our eye moves as a series of stops and starts. The saccades are the movements, and the stops are called fixations. So when we stop our eye movement, it focuses our attention. And it's this attention that enhances what we think about, or the mental processing about what it is that we're seeing, or what that object or word is that we're looking at. And so measuring eye movement can be a measure of attention. And as we think about, you know, what captures interest, what are people thinking about, what is getting them to look at something, we can measure eye movement with 2 eye tracking devices. Now, the one that we've been migrating toward, we have used a set of glasses, but I really like the versatility and the replicability of this little bar that can be attached to the bottom of a computer screen. And the device that we're using is manufactured by Tobii, which is a company in Sweden, and we're using a relatively large color monitor. So it's also important that you understand that we did compensate participants for all the study with some sort of gift card or some sort of small compensation. And when we ask them to look at displays, what we're asking them to do is to just give us a verbal response. So we're not taking their attention away from the display, but we're asking them, how likely would you be to purchase an item from this display? And most of the time this is a 0 to 9 or a 10-point Likert scale. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples, and this was actually this was the sample display that we used in a rather large study that we are just now beginning to do the analysis on. We have data from 5 universities and 1 research facility in Canada, and we have about 300 consumers who looked at a total of 32 plant displays, not counting this one. So you're seeing the image as they would see the image, and we simply asked them how likely they would be to buy a plant from that display. One of the really cool things that we can do with this technology is to show the path of the movement of their eye through the display. And I'm going to show you a movie that shows how one participant viewed this display. Now, the path shows us exactly where they looked, and the size of the circle is an indication of how long they looked at each of those points in the display. So you'll notice the price got a lot of visual activity, as did the coleus down here. A little bit on that poor old foliage plant sitting on the side, but not much up here nor over here. Now I want to show you another consumer who looked at this, and you'll see this person really spent some time on the price, and they had very little visual activity over here. Now, one of the things that we can generate in order to summarize this data is called a heat map. And what you see here is the visual saturation of where a number of people looked over the few seconds that they viewed the slide. We have some visual activity over here. This is very faint green. These little mouse clicks indicate where the people started when they moved from the previous slide. And I can tell you there was a word down here that many of them read. And so when they started this slide, their eyes moved from this spot to another location. Another piece of information that the computer will generate for us is a cluster map, and it shows us where many of the people looked and where very few of the people looked. Now it's important to remember this was computer generated, and what we are doing is working on generating these areas of interest so that we can then measure visual activity here and compare that with another area, perhaps the visual activity here. Let me show you kind of how this works. So we might have area 1 that's a price area and area 2 that is full of plant material. And as you saw, we have the path of the gaze, and we also have the length of the gaze. So the 4 measures that we are looking at are fixations, and so there would be 3 fixations in this area. Those are glances or looks. So we get a time to first fixation. So how long does it take them to look here at the price versus how long does it take them to look here at an object? Another measure we're using is first fixation duration. So how big is this circle compared to this circle? A third measure we're using is fixation count, or how many looks it gets. 3 fixations here, 5 fixations there. And then the measure that I like the best is this measure, I call it the measure of thought. It's total visit duration. So this is the number of glances times the length of the glance. So in essence, total visit duration adds up all of these circles and gives us one single measure. Now let me show you the last piece that I want to cover is this study that we did for Valentine's Day. So we showed 70 consumers these 4 flowering plants, these chocolate gifts, these cut flowers, and these bottles of wine. And you'll notice that the price point is the same for each of the 4 different product categories. So we compared the visual activity for this very small area, the area of interest of the price, with the visual activity of this larger, much more interesting area. And in this case, it was a plant. And you can see one of the actual gaze plots embedded in this area of interest. So I want to walk you through this table because there's some really fascinating things here. So the time to first fixation, so when did they first look at the item and when did they first look at the price? It was less than 0.15 of a second to first fixate on the gift, whether it was the flower, the wine, or the chocolate. And it took them almost 2 seconds, 1.7 seconds to get to the price. Now, that's not surprising because when you think about how big that item is relative to the price, that really is the thing that stands out. But I was surprised to see that their first gaze, or the first fixation, was held almost as long for the item, only 0.04 of a second longer than for the price. So what this is telling me is they're getting the same kind of first glance at both price and product almost equally. Now, how many times or how many glances, or excuse me, let me go to this one, the fixation count. How many glances did they get? 12 looks at the item versus a half a look at the price on average. And this is my measure of thought. So what I'm seeing here is this is the fixation count times fixation duration. They're looking at this 4 seconds and they're looking at price almost 1/10 of a second. So I'm wondering if this almost 40-to-1 ratio is going to hold up for different product categories, because none of this has been reported in the literature with regard to any type of product. And this is what I just walked you through. Sorry about that. So here's kind of my punchline, and I think this is the pièce de résistance. So remember we asked them how likely they would be to buy the particular product. And this is that measure of thought, fixation count. Well, what we saw, if they hated it and they said, not going to buy that at all, or they loved it, up here, remember the scale is 0 to 9. When we correlated that with fixation count, what we saw was a very nice relationship. If they hated it or they loved it, they spent very little time, whereas if they were indecisive, they had a higher fixation count. And we were very excited to see this because we considered this basically a pilot study. And we have this very fascinating finding with a very nice hardware. So we don't have a whole lot of conclusions here that we can, that we really are going to stand on firmly. We know that items are more complex than prices, and they do get more attention. So we're interested to see if we get similar visual interest across products. Price got the same visual interest across products, and we need to see if this holds across other studies. So when we looked at how much time they looked at price for chocolate, wine, cut flowers, and flowering plants, price got about the same visual interest across all those 4 products. We need to see if that's going to hold across other studies. I didn't show you today because of some time constraints, but we found some interesting differences by age and by gender. We want to look at those much more, and just to give you an indication of some of the things that we're looking at, we are interested to see how much visual interest people get when they're more impulsive in their buying strategy. We're interested to see how long terms like water conservation can get in terms of visual interest. You know, that's why I was showing you water conservation, or excuse me, energy conservation really was the word that resonated most. And now we want to see how that relates to visual interest. So we have a couple of data sets that we're working on and a couple of publications in progress, but we've got much more to come and lots more studies to do. So Charlie, I think that takes us just about to the end of the information that I wanted to present. I guess maybe we could see what questions some of the participants have.
Bridget, this is amazing because you and I had talked about speaking for 37 minutes and then opening it up for questions, and you hit it right on the second. That was unbelievable. Great job. So we do have a whole slew of questions that have come in, so I'll just start at the top and we'll knock out as many as we can. The first question is, although the flowering shrub group, this is for the first study, although the flowering shrub group was not as interested in water-saving production practices, did this group or any other groups care about whether the plants they purchased were considered to be water-saving plants?
We did not ask them anything about water saving in the landscape or after it left the production facility. And we know that, you know, research answers a few questions and we always have more questions. Certainly this is an avenue that we need to explore because thinking about sustainability in production is one piece of the equation, but we also need to think about how does that play a role in that plant performing in the landscape or on the patio. And so we didn't answer that, but that is something that we are aware that we need to investigate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the second one is, did you do analysis to determine if there were any differences between U.S. and Canadian consumers within the various groups? A?
Yes, we did. And Ben Campbell was our colleague in Canada. He's now at the University of Massachusetts. And we really did not see as many differences. We saw a few, and I would say a handful of differences between Canadian consumers and U.S. consumers. And so the take-home message there is when you're marketing products in North America, there are some differences, but we saw more by the plant that was purchased than by the place that they lived.
Exactly. Now, moving to the pricing study, we had a couple of questions that asked about the time frame for the study, what time of the year the 3-week study was done.
So this was in, it was in May, but our retailers were geographically dispersed. So some of the retailers did this a couple of weeks before the other ones did, because as we know, spring starts in the south and moves up towards the north. So I don't have the actual weeks in front of me that we recorded the data from the different places, but because we're very comfortable with the methodology, because each of the retailers was at the beginning of their season, and each of them followed the same pattern of increasing prices of the branded product 10% per week. So, yeah.
Okay. And staying on that same study, in the price branding study, were there any differences in plant quality, container size, etc.? Were the PW plants in branded containers and labeled with PW tags?
I'm confident they were in PW containers with PW tags, and we were very careful to instruct the retailers to get comparable species and cultivars in comparable containers. So I'm comfortable with that. Now, could some of that product have been in a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller, 4 1/4? It's possible. But to have this kind of compelling evidence from 3 reputable garden centers, I think is a great place to start. And as I said earlier, we tend in research to, well, our recipients would like us to answer all questions. We tend to be able to answer 1 or 2. So here we see evidence that the the demand is relatively inelastic, which means we can raise prices without hurting total revenue as much as we think we're going to hurt it. But do we need to do more research? Absolutely. We have a couple of groups of plants from 3 retailers, and we believe that this will show in other retailers under other weather conditions at other times, but we need to test that.
Yeah. Another question on that same study is in the price elasticity experiment, the first 2 locations saw volume increases in unbranded when increasing branded pricing. What do you attribute that to?
That's a good question. And I think you've got to think about how intricate it is to understand demand. And so that's why you do multiple types of plants in multiple brands in multiple containers. So there are any number of exogenous variables, things that we did not study, that could have come into play there. I don't have a good explanation for that, but we do want to see if this will hold up again.
I think that also might have to do with market share and substitution effects as consumers were switching from branded plants to unbranded plants. That was what we effectively saw.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Marco. And he really is the expert on elasticity of demand.
Okay, so if we move down to the eye tracking study, it says in the eye contact study, were there any trials done using a display of one type or cultivar of plants? The coleus display slide showed 3 different cultivars. If there was a study with displays of the same cultivar, and different cultivars, were there any differences in visual interest between the displays?
I'm gonna try to answer that question in a little bit different way. When we initially started out, we used the eye tracking glasses, and we had customers select the best plant from a display of relatively homogeneous plants. And what we started to notice was they wouldn't even look through the whole display because, and this is my conclusion, they would get about a quarter of the way through the plant material, either into the bench or across the bench, and they would stop. And I think this was because there wasn't enough visual difference to get their eye to move on. And so to answer the question directly, no, in these studies we have not done anything with homogeneous plants, because I should probably go back and publish that finding, but we didn't see enough visual diversity. People would get a quarter of the way into a bench or part of the way across a bench, and when they thought or they saw plant quality, plant diversity very much the same, they stopped looking. And to get this kind of visual interest where you're kind of bouncing back and forth, we're getting them to think about that product more. And if we think about merchandising, especially in non-plant areas, they want to show you more of an integrated look. And so there is a lot of visual interest and diversity there. And that's why I want to stick with maybe not tremendously diverse plant material, but having enough visual interest that we get them to look at that for more than a couple of seconds.
Okay, and then I think you just answered a couple of questions with that answer. That was pretty good.
Thanks. I didn't even see the questions.
Yeah. Here's another question. Did the consumer see the original price before you reduced it?
Oh, yes. Yes, in the pricing study, yes. I mean, if if they had come in and there is evidence that people make multiple trips in the spring season, absolutely they would have seen the lower price. Now, if the participant is talking about the eye tracking study, one of the things that we're investigating, and my master's student Allison Jones will be working on this especially, when we change the price, does that affect a change in visual interest? So does a lower price get people to look at it longer than a higher price? We don't know yet. Stay tuned.
Exactly, and there's probably some follow-up studies that need to be conducted just to flesh out some of the remaining questions.
Yeah, exactly. We collected this data in May and June of this spring, and as you might imagine, it's a very large data set, and Allison and Lynn have been working on it this summer to pull it together. So we're just now ready to turn that over to our colleagues and really begin to delve into that analysis.
Yeah. And of course, one thing just to reiterate is regarding the differentiation effects on elasticity and the phenomena that we're talking about in terms of increasing price in an inelastic demand market or inelastic situation. It only works. Inelasticity is only formulated by your ability to differentiate the product. So if you've been successful at differentiation, that increases the inelasticity of the product, and you have those effects. The point being is that if you're not doing a good job of differentiating your product and you try raising your prices, it may not work. That's the key thing.
Yeah, that's a good point, Charlie.
Yeah. And I had one comment that just came in. It's not a question, Bridget, but I think you'll appreciate this. It's just a comment. It says, "Bridget rocks!" Exclamation mark.
Oh, well, thank you.
So we have a number of other related questions. I think we've answered most of those with your comments. So we're right at time for our scheduled webinar slot. So let me just say I appreciate the time that you spent with us today, Bridget. We'll continue looking through these questions, and if there's any follow-up with folks that we need to do directly, we'll do that. One other comment that I just see, Bridget, is we were asked whether we could get some notes for today's session. Of course, we'll have the recorded webinar. Are you willing to share a PDF file of your slides, Bridget?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. We have the customer segmentation paper in review right now with Hort Science, and we hope to share that with the trade press as soon as we hear about whether that's been accepted or not. And you know, I just tell folks we'll be sharing the eye tracking stuff as we get it published.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So let me just remind folks that the recorded version of this webinar will be posted on the Ellison Chair website, and you'll be getting an email with a link to that particular recording. So thank you very much again for attending today. Bridget, thanks again for some great information. And stay tuned for the emails regarding the next webinar in the series. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.